It was supposed to be an ordinary flight. No flashing cameras, no screaming fans, no red carpets or headlines. Just a long international journey, quiet cabin lights, and passengers settling into their seats. Among them was Cristiano Ronaldo, dressed simply, calm, almost unrecognizable to anyone not paying close attention. He wasn't traveling with an entourage or demanding special treatment. In fact, most people on board had no idea that one of the most famous athletes in the world had just walked onto their plane. Then something unexpected happened. At the entrance of the first-class cabin, a flight crew member paused. They glanced at their tablet, then back at Ronaldo. Polite, professional, but firm. "I'm sorry, sir. Your seat isn't available here." For a brief moment, the air felt heavier. This wasn't about fame. This wasn't about money. It was about a decision that, at the time, seemed small and routine. Just another passenger. Just another seat assignment. But everyone nearby felt it. Ronaldo looked around the cabin quietly. No frustration. No raised voice. No attempt to explain who he was. Instead, he gave a slight nod, thanked the crew member, and turned toward the economy section. That's when something strange happened. People started noticing. Whispers followed him down the aisle. A few passengers stared longer than necessary. Some looked confused, others curious. A few pulled out their phones, unsure whether they were really seeing what they thought they were seeing. But Ronaldo didn't react. He placed his bag overhead, took his seat, and sat down like any other traveler. Headphones on, eyes forward, completely composed. To the flight crew, it looked like the situation was over. Problem solved. Seat assigned. Flight ready for takeoff. But beneath that calm surface, something had shifted. Because what they didn't realize was this. Ronaldo wasn't upset. He wasn't offended. And he wasn't planning to complain. He was waiting. And in less than 30 minutes, the meaning of that quiet decision would unfold in a way no one on that aircraft could have predicted. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. As the aircraft doors closed and the engines began their low, steady hum, the cabin settled into an uneasy calm. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. Passengers adjusted their seats, fastened seatbelts, and scrolled through their phones. The flight crew moved through the aisle, performing their routine checks with practiced precision. But something felt different. Ronaldo sat quietly in his seat, near the middle of the economy cabin. His posture was relaxed, his expression unreadable. He didn't look frustrated. He didn't look embarrassed. In fact, he looked unusually focused, almost as if he were somewhere else entirely. Most people would have reacted differently. Some would have argued. Some would have demanded explanations. Others would have quietly stewed in anger. Ronaldo did none of that, and that silence began to draw attention. A man across the aisle leaned toward his companion and whispered, "Is that really him?" The companion glanced over, hesitated, then nodded slowly. A few rows back, someone discreetly raised their phone, pretending to check messages while secretly angling the camera. The recognition spread quietly, seat by seat, row by row. Still, Ronaldo didn't acknowledge it. He slipped on his headphones and closed his eyes, as if the world around him didn't exist. To the flight crew, this confirmed their assumption. The situation had ended peacefully. No issues, no complaints, just another passenger blending into the cabin. But that assumption was about to be tested. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the cabin lights dimmed slightly. The seatbelt sign switched off. People began to relax. Drinks were prepared. Conversations softened into background noise. That's when the atmosphere subtly shifted. A flight attendant paused near the galley, glancing toward the economy section. She noticed several passengers whispering, their eyes repeatedly drifting in the same direction. Phones were no longer hidden as carefully. A few people leaned into the aisle, trying to get a clearer look. Something wasn't right. Another crew member walked past Ronaldo's row, then slowed their pace. They glanced down, just briefly, then looked again. Recognition flickered across their face. A quiet realization set in. This wasn't just a passenger who had accepted a seat change without protest. This was someone the entire world recognized. Someone whose image filled stadiums, screens, and headlines. Someone known not only for success, but for discipline, professionalism, and respect. Yet there he was, sitting silently in economy, causing no disruption, making no demands. The contrast was unsettling. The crew exchanged subtle looks. No words, just glances that carried unspoken questions. Did we miss something? Did we make a mistake? Still, no one approached him. Minutes passed. The plane cruised steadily through the sky. The murmurs among passengers grew louder, more confident. A child tugged at their parent's sleeve, pointing discreetly. Someone chuckled softly in disbelief. And Ronaldo remained exactly the same. Calm, composed, unmoved. That's when the flight crew began to feel something unfamiliar. Not fear, not panic, regret. Because they were starting to understand that this moment, this quiet, almost invisible decision, was about to become something far bigger than a seating issue. And they were standing right in the middle of IT first. It seemed like nothing more than curiosity. A famous face, an unexpected seat, a story passengers would quietly share after landing. But beneath the surface, something far more subtle was unfolding, something almost no one noticed at the beginning. Ronaldo wasn't just sitting quietly. He was paying attention. Every movement in the cabin, every interaction between crew members, every reaction from the passengers around him. Not in a confrontational way, not with irritation or judgment, but with calm awareness, like someone who had learned long ago that behavior reveals more than words ever could. A flight attendant passed by his row, offering drinks. Ronaldo removed one side of his headphones, smiled politely, and thanked her. No mention of seating, no hint of dissatisfaction, just respect. That moment lingered. Because to the crew, it was unexpected. They were used to a different response from high-profile travelers. Requests, clarifications, sometimes entitlement. But this was different. This was someone who didn't need to prove anything. And that difference began to stand out. As the service continued, passengers nearby started to engage with him. A man leaned over from the aisle and quietly said, "I just wanted to say, I'm a big fan." Ronaldo nodded, thanked him sincerely, and returned to his seat. No scene, no disruption, no attempt to draw attention. Yet, ironically, that restraint was doing the opposite. Across the cabin, more eyes were drawn toward him. Conversations shifted. People weren't just whispering about who he was anymore. They were talking about how he was acting. Did you see how calm he is? He didn't even complain. That's actually impressive. The flight crew noticed this change. They could feel the energy in the cabin slowly realigning, like gravity shifting in a room. Ronaldo wasn't demanding respect, but he was earning it quietly, moment by moment. Then came the detail that changed everything. A senior crew member reviewed the passenger manifest again, just to be sure. Names, seat numbers, special notes. And there it was. A familiar name. A confirmed first-class booking. A last-minute adjustment made due to a seating issue that had already been resolved. The realization was immediate and uncomfortable. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be brushed aside. This wasn't a simple inconvenience. It was an error that had been handled too quickly and without enough attention. But more importantly, it was an error that the passenger himself had chosen not to expose. Ronaldo could have corrected it instantly. He could have spoken up. He could have demanded what was already his. Instead, he stayed silent. That silence now felt heavy, because it reframed everything. The crew began to understand that this situation wasn't escalating because Ronaldo was being difficult. It was escalating because he was being respectful. And that made it worse. A quiet discussion unfolded near the galley. Low voices, careful wording. No one wanted to draw attention. The question wasn't whether the situation should be addressed. It was how. Approaching him now felt different than it would have 30 minutes earlier. This wasn't about correcting a seating issue anymore. It was about acknowledging character. Meanwhile, Ronaldo sat calmly, scrolling through something on his phone, completely unaware, or so it seemed, of the internal debate unfolding just a few meters away. But here's the truth. He knew something was coming. Not because he expected special treatment, but because experience had taught him how moments like this unfold. People don't regret mistakes instantly. They regret them when they understand who they were dealing with. And that understanding had finally arrived. The cabin had changed. The crew had changed. And now, the next move would define everything. Because once respect enters the room, there's no going back. And the flight crew was about to make a decision that would shift the entire tone of the journey. That'd be why the time the aircraft had been cruising for nearly an hour, the cabin no longer felt the same. What began as a routine flight had quietly transformed into something else. Something unspoken, but unmistakable. The energy had shifted, not because of an announcement or an incident, but because of awareness. People knew. Passengers were no longer whispering in disbelief. They were watching with quiet respect. Some avoided staring, as if doing so might break the strange calm that had settled over the economy cabin. Others glanced over occasionally, still trying to understand how someone so globally recognized could sit there so comfortably without protest. In the galley, the flight crew stood close together. Their expressions were no longer neutral. They were thoughtful. One of them checked the manifest again, just to be certain. Another replayed the earlier interaction in their mind. The moment at the first-class entrance, the polite refusal, the nod, the acceptance. At the time, it had felt routine. Now it felt different, because the mistake wasn't just procedural. It was human. Finally, the decision was made. A senior crew member straightened their uniform, took a steady breath, and began walking down the aisle toward Ronaldo's seat. Each step felt heavier than the last. Not because of fear, but because of awareness. This wasn't an authority approaching a passenger. This was someone approaching a person who had chosen grace over entitlement. The crew member stopped beside Ronaldo's row and waited politely. Ronaldo noticed immediately. He removed his headphones and looked up, calm and attentive. "Yes," he said softly. The tone mattered. There was no irritation, no about time, no edge in his voice, just openness. The crew member spoke quietly, keeping the conversation private. "Sir, we've reviewed your booking, and there appears to have been a mistake earlier." A pause. Nearby passengers tried not to listen, but everyone was listening. "We'd like to apologize for the confusion," the crew member continued. "Your first-class seat is available if you'd like to move." For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. This was the turning point. This was where most people would react. Some would feel validated. Some would feel justified. Some would make sure everyone knew they were right. Ronaldo did none of that. He looked around, not at the crew member, but at the passengers sitting nearby. People who had shared this quiet space with him. People who had whispered, smiled, and offered nods of respect. And he looked back up. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I appreciate you checking." The simplicity of the response caught the crew member off guard. There was no triumph in it, no subtle victory, just acknowledgement. He gathered his belongings calmly and stood, thanking the passengers next to him as he stepped into the aisle. A few offered small smiles. One man nodded with genuine admiration. No applause, no spectacle, just understanding. As Ronaldo walked toward the front of the aircraft, the reaction was impossible to miss. The cabin watched in silence, not because they were starstruck, but because they had witnessed something rare. A reversal without ego. When he reached the first-class cabin, the crew welcomed him again, this time with a tone that was noticeably different. More careful, more respectful, not because of his status, but because of how he had handled the moment. As he settled into his seat, the cabin behind him seemed to exhale. The tension dissolved, replaced by something warmer, almost reassuring. The situation had been corrected, but more importantly, something else had been revealed. Character. And for the flight crew, that realization would linger far longer than the flight itself. Because sometimes the most powerful turning point isn't loud. It's quiet. And once it happens, nothing feels the same again. The first-class cabin was quieter than usual. Not because it was empty, not because there was less service, not because anyone was distracted. It was quiet because something profound had just happened, something the flight crew and passengers alike were only beginning to understand. Ronaldo sat in his seat, upright but relaxed, a slight smile on his face. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look self-satisfied. He didn't even glance around to see who was watching. He had done nothing extraordinary in action, nothing flashy, Nothing that would make headlines. And yet, the impact of his presence and his behavior was undeniable. Back in the economy section, a flight attendant quietly whispered to a colleague, "Did you notice how calm he was?" Her colleague nodded, eyes wide. Not just calm, composed. He didn't even react when he could have. He didn't make it about himself at all. This realization began to sink in, slowly but unmistakably. The crew understood something fundamental. They hadn't just been dealing with a simple mistake about a seat. They had been observing character, and they had underestimated it. For a moment, the silence in the cabin felt almost heavy, like air before a storm. But it wasn't fear. It was reflection. Passengers who had been whispering earlier were now watching differently. Some were leaning slightly forward in their seats, trying to grasp what they had just witnessed. A few older travelers shook their heads in quiet admiration. A child, seated near the aisle, looked up at their parent and asked softly, "Why is he sitting there and not angry?" The parent shrugged, smiling faintly, because some people don't need to fight to be respected. And that was the truth. The flight crew, too, could feel it. There was a subtle shift in their posture, a small acknowledgement in the way they moved through the cabin. They had made a mistake, one they couldn't undo retroactively, but they were beginning to understand the depth of what they had witnessed. They realized that Ronaldo had shown them something that no first-class seat, no fame, no money could ever buy: restraint, integrity, true class. It was humbling, because in that quiet cabin, far above the clouds, the hierarchy of status, the unspoken rules about who gets what, suddenly seemed irrelevant. Ronaldo had chosen dignity over entitlement, patience over confrontation, respect over self-interest. And in doing so, he had turned what could have been a moment of tension into a moment of reflection for everyone on board. The emotional impact rippled subtly. Crew members exchanged glances. Passengers looked on with curiosity and admiration. And even some travelers who had initially been annoyed or skeptical now smiled quietly to themselves. It was a lesson being delivered without words, without judgment, without spectacle. The realization was sharp and immediate. True respect isn't demanded. It's observed. It's earned quietly. It's a silent command that forces others to pause and reflect. And as Ronaldo leaned back in his seat, earbuds in place once again, his gaze forward, there was no arrogance in his eyes, only calm awareness. For those watching him, the lesson was unforgettable. Some would remember it for days. Some would share the story after landing. Others would think about it for weeks, reflecting on their own reactions in moments of conflict, on how quickly they judged someone or assumed someone would act a certain way. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about human behavior, humility, and the subtle power of composure. And for the flight crew, the realization was almost painful in its clarity. Mistakes are inevitable, but the way they are met and the way people respond reveals far more than any formal procedure ever could. Ronaldo had turned a simple, ordinary flight into a profound lesson on respect, patience, and dignity. And it hit everyone on board harder than any announcement, any seating chart, or any rule could have it be. Why now? The quiet hum of the engines had become a backdrop to something far more intense than any turbulence. The aircraft cabin was still, but not with silence alone. There was a palpable tension, almost electric, running through both passengers and crew. The flight crew, once confident in their decisions, once sure of their authority, now moved differently. Every step felt deliberate. Every glance carried a measure of hesitation. They had made a mistake earlier, and that mistake had seemed minor at first, just a seat assignment. But now it was clear that the error had underestimated the man in front of them. Ronaldo had shown them something they couldn't have expected: patience, humility, restraint. And with that, the weight of regret began to settle in. A senior flight attendant approached once more, this time with a careful, measured pace. She had rehearsed her words silently, though no words could fully convey the recognition building inside her. "Sir," she began softly, voice steady but tinged with emotion, "earlier, we made an error with your seating." Ronaldo looked up calmly, as though inviting her to continue. There was no impatience, no frustration, just attentiveness. The attendant's eyes flickered to his composed face, and she swallowed, realizing the gravity of the situation. Not the seating itself, but the conduct, the patience, the dignity he had displayed. We should have handled it differently, she admitted. And we want to sincerely apologize for the confusion and inconvenience. There was a pause, a breath, a moment stretched longer than any passenger realized. For a fleeting second, it felt like the flight crew themselves were children being taught a lesson they hadn't expected to receive at this altitude, above the clouds, in the confines of a metal tube traveling at hundreds of miles per hour. Ronaldo, with his calm demeanor intact, simply nodded. "Thank you," he said, voice quiet but clear. "I appreciate your honesty." That was all. No dramatics, no demand for compensation, no reminders of fame or status. Just acknowledgement, just humanity. And in that acknowledgement, the crew felt a shift. They realized the depth of their error, not because of the mistake itself, but because of the missed opportunity to act with foresight and respect. They had misjudged a situation, and more importantly, they had misjudged a person. The regret wasn't loud or chaotic. It didn't explode into accusations or tension. It was quiet, heavy, and deeply humbling. Crew members exchanged glances with each other. Subtle nods passed between them. Silent communication acknowledging what they had learned and what they now understood. Meanwhile, passengers noticed the subtle transformation as well. A few caught fragments of the conversation. A shared glance between two travelers said it all. Something remarkable had unfolded, something beyond ordinary observation. It wasn't a spectacle. It wasn't newsworthy in the traditional sense. It was a lesson in character, quietly delivered at 35,000 feet. And for the crew, it hit harder than any policy violation, any procedural mistake, any customer complaint ever could. They had witnessed the power of restraint. They had seen the force of humility. They had been confronted by dignity so profound that it left them silently reflecting on their own actions. And in that reflection, regret bloomed. Not shameful, not humiliating, but thoughtful, respectful. A recognition that they had underestimated someone who didn't need to assert dominance to command it. The remainder of the flight passed differently. Interactions became gentler. Eyes were warmer. Smiles were more genuine. No one needed to announce the lesson aloud. It had been learned. And in the first-class cabin, Ronaldo sat calmly, eyes forward, calm as ever. But behind that composure, a quiet awareness lingered. The ripple of his restraint had reached everyone on board. This wasn't about a seat anymore. It was about human behavior, empathy, and the quiet power of doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. And the regret? It was not punishment. It was understanding. A lesson delivered through respect. One the crew would carry long after the wheels touched the runway. As the aircraft began its descent, the cabin seemed to carry a different weight. Not of tension, not of fatigue, not of impatience, but of reflection. Something had shifted quietly, invisibly, yet unmistakably. Passengers settled into their seats with a newfound awareness. The earlier murmurs had died down, replaced by contemplative glances and quiet smiles. Even those who hadn't been paying attention earlier seemed to sense the gravity of what had unfolded. Ronaldo sat calmly in first class now, headphones off, eyes forward, composed as ever. But the impact of his actions during that flight had already spread far beyond the aisle he had first walked through. It was a lesson that transcended airline procedures, seating arrangements, and celebrity status. The flight crew moved with subtle care now, but their steps carried a different tone. There was no tension, no fear of authority, no need to correct a situation anymore. Instead, they carried respect, earned silently, without a single demand from the passenger. They had learned something far more valuable than following rules. True respect isn't demanded. True class isn't bought. And true influence isn't shown through force or protest. It's revealed quietly, through humility, restraint, and integrity. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, there was no fanfare. No applause. No cameras flashing inside the cabin. And yet, for everyone on board, the lesson had been unforgettable. Passengers began to gather their belongings, sharing quiet glances and hushed words. Conversations now weren't about who was famous or who had been wronged. They were about behavior, choices, and character. About how one person's patience and composure had transformed a small mistake into a moment of reflection for dozens of strangers. The flight crew, now walking down the aisle with passengers disembarking around them, carried a mix of humility and respect. They had faced a mistake. They had been tested, not by anger or confrontation, but by quiet dignity. And in that test, they had been humbled. Ronaldo gathered his own things, moving with effortless grace. He offered polite nods to passengers as he passed. No exaggeration, no theatrics, just acknowledgement, just humanity. That's when the full lesson crystallized. Greatness isn't measured by recognition. Power isn't measured by assertion. And respect isn't something that can be demanded. It's something you inspire through the way you act when no one is forcing your hand. For everyone on that plane, it was a reminder. The simplest actions often carry the greatest weight. The smallest gestures, the quietest words, or even silence itself can leave impressions far stronger than any display of authority. Ronaldo's choice to remain composed, to accept the unexpected, and to respond with dignity had created ripples, subtle, powerful, lasting. And those ripples would linger in the minds of the flight crew, the passengers, and anyone they shared the story with afterward. Because what happens when you meet mistakes with patience, misjudgment with humility, and disruption with calm? You teach more than any lecture ever could. You inspire more than any display of power ever could. You show that true class, integrity, and strength are often silent, but unforgettable. As the passengers filed out, the cabin emptied, and the engines powered down, one truth remained clear. A first-class seat doesn't define class. Recognition doesn't define respect. And in moments that test us, the quiet choice to act with dignity can leave a mark far deeper than fame, money, or status ever could. And that, in the end, is the lesson that lasts.